You are listening to the Norton Library Podcast, where we explore classic works of literature and philosophy with the leading scholars of the Norton Library, a new series from W.W. Norton that introduces influential texts to a new generation of readers. I'm your host, Mark Chirino, with Michael Von Cannon producing. Today, we present the first of our two episodes devoted to Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe, as we interview its editor, Susan M. Ryan. In part one, we discuss Stowe's background, her politics, and her writing career. We explore this hugely influential novel and its legacy and the characters that populate it. Susan Ryan is professor of English at the University of Louisville. She is the author of The Grammar of Good Intentions, Race and the Antebellum Culture of Benevolence, and The Moral Economies of American Authorship, Reputation, Scandal, and the 19th-Century Literary Marketplace. It is great to have her with us. Susan Ryan, welcome to the Norton Library Podcast.
Thanks for inviting me.
Well, we're so excited to talk with you about your edition of Uncle Tom's Cabin. And maybe we can start by talking about Harriet Beecher Stowe herself. You talk a lot about her in the introduction. What do we need to know about her in order to approach her great novel?
She was born in summer of 1811 in Litchfield, Connecticut, to a family full of ministers and writers. And she was not the only famous person in her family. I think that's important to know. Her father, Lyman Beecher, was a prominent Presbyterian minister and a notorious anti-Catholic. Some blamed him for inspiring some anti-Catholic riots in New England. Whether that's valid or not, I couldn't say. Her older sister, Catherine Beecher, was a prominent educator, founded a girls' seminary that Harriet herself attended. Catherine Beecher published domestic advice manuals and other writings and was actually pretty conservative. I mean, not quite Erica Kirk level, but anti-suffrage, definitely invested in traditional gender roles, traditional notions of femininity. Harriet's younger brother, 2 years younger, Henry Ward Beecher, was probably the most popular preacher of his era. He was hugely influential, and not to gravitate always toward the prurient, but he was involved in a very lurid sex scandal in the 1870s. He was accused of an affair with a friend's wife. He was sued for adultery. But the big takeaways from Harriet Beecher Stowe's family: deep immersion in Protestant Christianity, abundant access to books, education, access to publication. Probably also important is the loss of her mother in childhood. So in Uncle Tom's Cabin, there's this endless reiteration of parental loss, of threatened separation of parents and children, particularly mothers and children. And I have to think that early experience was formative in that way, though the entire culture was obsessed with dying children. So it wasn't just Stowe who had that fixation.
Was Stowe educated formally, or was it just that there were books and an educated family around the house?
I would say both. She attended the Hartford Female Seminary, which is the school her sister ran. So lots of family influence there. She was a little early for the flourishing of women's colleges. So I think Mount Holyoke was founded in the 1830s. That was one of the really early New England women's colleges. And she had kind of aged out of post-secondary education by that point. So her brothers all went to university, but she and her sister did not. But the formal education that she had was way beyond what most women of the time had access to. And it did include some exposure to the classics. It was not finishing school. It was much more in depth than that.
Was her interest in social issues, did that predate her interest in writing, or did it kind of coincide? Is it inextricable?
Uncle Tom's Cabin is her first novel, and she published quite a bit before that. Sketches, stories, a religious tract with the American Tract Society, but nothing that stood out as particularly political. And she actually says in the final chapter of Uncle Tom's Cabin, the concluding remarks, that for a long time she had avoided the issue of slavery, that it was too painful. And we can talk later in the interview about some of the things that prompted the writing of that book. Mm-hmm. But I don't perceive her as having been particularly political before writing Uncle Tom's Cabin. It's also important to know that she married at 25, which was just a little bit later than average for the time. And she had 7 children by the time she was 50. One set of twins, and then the others were single pregnancies. So she was very busy with birthing and nurturing children. And then she was writing Uncle Tom's Cabin at around age 40, 41.
Did she have a specific immersion in the abolition movement?
I would say she had exposure. She was living in Cincinnati as a young adult, and that's where her father took over the presidency of Lane Theological Seminary in Cincinnati. And that's where she met the man she ended up marrying, Calvin Stowe, who was a widower. And there were debates about the slavery question at Lane Theological Seminary that became quite controversial. There was sort of a fissure, and a number of people left Lane because the institution's sort of caution about the slavery issue kind of alienated some more ardent abolitionists in that community. There's good evidence that she was paying attention to the slavery issue. She read widely. We can see in concluding remarks and in A Key to Uncle Tom's Cabin, she was immersed in sort of the coverage of the slavery issue, media coverage of slavery. And also living in Cincinnati, she would have had abundant exposure to stories of people escaping slavery, stories of recapture, things that were just bubbling up in the community at the time. By the time she was actually writing Uncle Tom's Cabin, she was living in Maine, so much more removed.
Susan, one more question about Stowe's career after Uncle Tom's Cabin, because most people, it seems like if they've read one thing by Harriet Beecher Stowe, it's Uncle Tom's Cabin. What about the post-Uncle Tom's Cabin career?
After Uncle Tom's Cabin, she publishes a compendium called A Key to Uncle Tom's Cabin. And it's basically defending herself against her critics who claim that she was making this stuff up and exaggerating the horrors of slavery. And so the compilation includes evidence at sort of defending her take on the institution. And it shows a lot of the sources that she was working from. She also published a second anti-slavery novel called Dread, D-R-E-D, if anybody listening wants to look it up. I think she's responding in that book to the criticism she received about Uncle Tom's passivity. And so there's a little bit more sort of revolutionary energy in Dread. It gets forestalled before it emerges into full-blown rebellion. But she's definitely in conversation with her critics, I think, in that book. Her later writings, a number of novels set in New England that are not addressing the slavery issue, but have been categorized more as sort of New England regionalism. She also published, to return to scandal, one of my favorite themes, she published in 1870 a book called Lady Byron Vindicated, in which she defends her having weighed into a scandal involving Lord and Lady Byron. And that was quite controversial as well.
But your introduction points out, I mean, she was hugely prolific.
Oh, yes.
Even if Uncle Tom's Cabin is the one thing that maybe most readers can name, she was constantly churning out works.
She had a long, prolific writing career, and she made a lot of money from Uncle Tom's Cabin.
I'm sure.
So she didn't need to keep writing to pay the bills. I think she had just a tremendous creative energy.
You mentioned something that surprises me when you say that Stowe was responding to accusations of Uncle Tom's passivity. I guess I wasn't sure if that criticism came immediately after publication, or if this is something that we are like look back in the later 19th century or the 20th century, we look back with our more modern eyes at her depiction. But this was something that was an almost immediate response.
Oh, it was in the moment. So it's interesting to think about. So Stowe publishes this book, and it's hugely popular. People are reading it. People are buying it. But she's also being attacked by obviously pro-slavery advocates who are saying that, she's inventing this, she's exaggerating, slavery is this benign institution, she's making it sound so much worse than it is. She's also accused of being a pornographer because the story addresses obliquely but clearly the sexual abuse of enslaved women and girls. And so on the pro-slavery side, she was being accused of all of these things. But there's also a critique from more radical abolitionists who felt that the character of Uncle Tom was too perfect, too pure, too passive, and who hated the ending of the book when she sends her surviving characters to Liberia. That was a sore point among more radical abolitionists, because the sense was that the Liberian solution was essentially racist. This idea that the United States was a white nation, people of color need to leave in order to flourish. So yeah, she had plenty of critics on the abolitionist side, and the figure of Uncle Tom was a focus of that.
When Stowe is writing Uncle Tom's Cabin, her goal is to make this a realistic novel, like capital R. Is that the genre of literature that she intends it for? So charges that she's stretching the truth or romanticizing it would have hurt her?
I think realism is the wrong word. I think she would have said that she's representing the truth of slavery. Truth can emerge in a lot of narrative forms that are not necessarily clearly realist. So there is certainly an emotional and dramatic intensity there in the book that most of us don't experience in our day-to-day lives. But I think she would say that she's getting at the truth of slavery.
Getting at the truth of slavery so that her knowledge of the practice of slavery, of the various characters that she's depicting, are authentic.
That's what she wanted to claim. Many people accused her of, inauthenticity on the one hand, and then theft on the other hand.
Plagiarism.
Right. She drew on the narratives of self-emancipating slaves, particularly the narrative of a man named Josiah Henson, to the point where, if you're familiar with Ishmael Reed's novel, Flight to Canada, early on in that novel, he actually calls her a plagiarist. And he also calls her Naughty Harriet because of her forays into these sexually prurient topics.
We talked about how this novel was received, how it was a phenomenal bestseller upon publication. What was its impact in 1852 and the decade beyond? How did it become such a cultural force?
That's super complicated. So Stowe set out to change hearts and minds. She is explicitly trying to move readers toward an anti-slavery position. And I don't doubt that that goal was successful with certain readers. What's astonishing to me is the degree to which readers were able to enjoy and talk about and kind of riff on this book while stripping it of its political implications. So there are all kinds of merchandising, I guess we could say, that accompanied the popularity of this book. And intellectual property law was really lax at the time. So Stowe didn't earn any profit from these various representations of the book. But there were card games, children's games, Uncle Tom's Cabin plates, wallpaper, figurines, children's stories, poems, a number of theatrical productions, some of which, gave Uncle Tom a happy ending or really turned the story into a minstrel show without, any anti-slavery content. So the book was surprisingly flexible in terms of what readers wanted to do with it. I think some people read it as an earnest anti-slavery foray, and I think others read it for the humor and the drama and the sweet, pure dying child, and really stripped it of its political implications.
So if she's trying to change hearts and minds and appeal to readers on both ends of the debate, she can't write this as a didactic novel or appear to attack the Southern way of life. It seems like she's got to thread the needle in an incredibly finessed way. Is that accurate?
Yes, though I wouldn't say that it's not a didactic novel. I think 19th century readers and authors understood didacticism in a very different way. I mean, for those of us working after modernism, didacticism is an insult, right? If it's didactic, it's bad. Whereas in the middle of the 19th century, the presumption was that literature was going to be didactic. It was just a question of whether it accomplished that in an aesthetically pleasing way or not. So the book is definitely didactic. Key to that, Simon Legree, her villain, is a Northern man. The figure of Miss Ophelia, to whom we'll return, is deeply flawed and Northern and has no idea how to affect her goals in this setting that she ends up in. There are a number of Southern white characters who are admirable, who are trying to do the right thing. So she's trying to spread the blame and she's trying to spread the heroism. That doesn't mean that pro-slavery Southern readers, felt that she was fair to them.
That's a great point. I would love to return to some of these characters in just a second. Before I do, your introduction mentioned two words that I would love for you to unpack for us. One is sentimentalism and the other is sensationalism. What are those two concepts and how do they apply to Uncle Tom's Cabin?
Big topic. So sentimentalism is certainly the mode that Stowe is working in. And as I say in the introduction, it's not just about making people cry. It's not just about pulling the heartstrings. It's tears with a purpose. And so these tableaus, these incredibly intense emotional moments in the book where there's a threatened loss of a child, or there's separation, there's longing for home, for example. All of that is in the service of the larger point, which is the wrongness of slavery. And she uses these narrative strategies to invite readers to identify with the figures in the book who are experiencing these losses and these threats, and invites them to cry, but not just to cry and to change. When I teach this book, I often ask myself, okay, who cried? Yeah. Right? And a lot of them admit that they did. And that the work can move people still, I think is part of its power. But she's not just working in a sentimental mode. Sentimentalism's sort of evil twin, I guess you could say, is sensationalism. So I write in the introduction, sentimentalism is about tears, mother's milk. The bodily fluids of sentimentalism are all over this book. There's tears and lactation, not in every single chapter, but certainly spread throughout. The bodily fluid of sensationalism is blood. And so that's also part of what she's doing here, is showing us these, beatings, cruelty, injustice. The character who dies in a basement and isn't found until the body is deteriorating. And so that kind of lurid attention to violence is the other way that she's grabbing her readers' attention and inviting them, to contemplate these horrors. I think for Stowe and for a lot of authors of the time, sentimentalism works best when it's paired with sensationalism.
It heightens it.
Absolutely. And it keeps people reading.
When you were talking about Uncle Tom earlier and about how he's viewed, Uncle Tom is a phrase that people know whether they've ever read Uncle Tom's Cabin. So who is Uncle Tom, and was he an Uncle Tom?
That is the key question, isn't it? Oh, my goodness.
Clear it up for us, Susan.
So, yes, Uncle Tom is an insult. And Uncle Tom is a complicit, compliant, white-identified coward. In particularly 20th century parlance, the term still comes up. The Uncle Tom of the novel is much more complicated than that. Stowe describes him as physically powerful. He's muscular. He's in the prime of his life. He's an excellent farm manager. He's capable. He's a loving family man. And there are moments in the novel when he seems overly compliant. Okay, Mr. Shelby sold me. I guess I'll just go because I wouldn't want the Shelby family to experience any financial hardship. Right. So there are these moments that
right.
I, as a reader, am just incredulous. No, please. But when we get to the Legree plantation and Tom's final crisis, he is sacrificing himself to save an enslaved woman and girl who are trying to escape. So it's a heroism that I think gets forgotten in the term Uncle Tom. And in fact, Legree hates Tom because Tom resists him. Not because Tom is complicit, but because Tom is resistant. He's resistant in a very quiet way, but that quietness has its own power, and Legree is acutely aware of that. It's also important to understand that within the novel, Tom is a figure of Christ. So self-sacrificing, messianic in a sense, bringing others to faith through his final passion and death.
Is Uncle Tom conscious of the sacrifice that he's making?
Oh, absolutely. It's entirely voluntary. He is going to take the beating so that these other two can get away.
When we did an episode on the narrative of Frederick Douglass, we mentioned that some of the depictions of the owners and overseers were monstrous, just pure evil. Is Simon Legree that way? Is he a pure villain?
Almost, but not quite. We get a little bit of his backstory, his descent into the conditions. There is a sense that he once was or could have been a better man. His alcohol use is a big factor. So Stowe was, like many of her contemporaries, a temperance advocate. She felt that alcohol use and abuse were sources of great evil. And so there's a lot of emphasis on Legree's alcoholism, fueling his violence, fueling his sexual abuse of the women on this plantation. And also he's a little bit pathetic in a way. He's very credulous. He believes in ghosts. He's easily tricked. He's definitely a villain. I mean, to the point where Simon Legree has also become a catchphrase, probably less potent than Uncle Tom. But, he was the Darth Vader of the 1850s. And he certainly would have been known Even people who didn't read the book would have known that term, Simon Legree.
I like the way Frederick Douglass puts it, which is that even people like Simon Legree are victims of slavery in their own way. They've succumbed to the practice and have lost their own humanity.
Exactly. And an important thing to understand about Uncle Tom's Cabin, and I always tell my students this, it's not that Stowe was aiming for subtlety and failed. Subtlety was not the goal. Right. I mean, it's a big, brash book that's not trying to be ambiguous or tricky, interpretively complicated. That's not what it's aiming for.
Is that true narratively or thematically or didactically? Is her point obvious or like her narrative plotting?
All of the above. It's certainly a complicated book, but it's not a subtle book.
It's just that description, it seems like novels run the risk of becoming heavy-handed, which makes them lose their potency. But it feels like with Uncle Tom's Cabin, that's not the case.
Yeah. And again, heavy-handedness is a culturally inflected term, right? I mean, 19th century readers expected didacticism, there may have been readers who felt, oh, this is over the top, this is too much, don't try to make me cry, I'm too cynical for that. But by and large, readers expected these narrative strategies.
What about Miss Ophelia?
She's one of my favorite.
That's why I ask, yeah.
Part of what I love about her is she's so rigid. She's so unself-aware, unself-reflective. She's sort of this figure of the limits of good intentions. The way that she comes into this situation with absolutely no sense of how to read a room. And she has to come to understand over time that discipline and indoctrination and threats are not going to get her what she wants. The only way she can reach this child, Topsy is the enslaved child that she's trying to help, trying to Christianize, trying to tame and regulate. The only way to reach this child is through love. And she eventually comes to understand that, but it is a difficult journey. And Stowe is using her as sort of straight man, comic foil, fish out of water narrative, all of those things. She has a lot to learn in this novel, and she's deeply resistant to that learning for a very long time.
And the last character that I'd love for you to talk about a little bit is Topsy.
Yes. Topsy is complicated. In some sense, Topsy is a minstrel show character. And she figured prominently in the stage productions that were aligned with or even embracing minstrelsy. She sings, she dances, she does kind of acrobatic moves. She's an inveterate thief. She's incorrigible. She knows nothing of Christian catechism when she first comes into this household. And so she is a little bit of she's used as a comic figure. She's also used as, this racist trope of the savage child in some sense. At the same time, she's a deeply sympathetic character. She wants love. She wants acceptance. She wants to feel a sense of belonging. And it's that connection that she's able to form with Eva, the family's, beloved, cherished white child, that starts to awaken this desire in her to connect to other people, to be, I wouldn't say compliant, because nothing about Topsy is ever going to be compliant, but to play the game a little bit so that she can start to get those things that she wants.
Well, there's so much more to talk about in our second episode, but this has been a great start. Susan Ryan, thank you so much for joining us on the Norton Library podcast to discuss your edition of Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin. The Norton Library edition of Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe, edited by Susan Ryan, is available now in paperback and ebook. Check out the links in the description to this episode for ordering options and more information about the Norton Library, including the full catalog of titles.